Okay, we finally come to the last lecture, Art in North America during the first half of the 20th century. In the last unit, we saw paintings by the Hudson River School, and we glanced briefly at modern painters such as Sargent and Whistler. America was joining the art world, although it would have achieved much greater importance after World War II, when New York replaced Paris as the epicenter of modern art. So this rather gritty painting of a drunk woman and two disapproving middle-class onlookers on a New York City street is an example of what was called the Ashcan school. So this is an American realist school. They had a political as well as an artistic objective. They wanted Americans to confront poverty and then do something about it. It's not a required image, but I really don't want you to think that the only U.S. painting in the 20th century was done in Harlem, great as the Harlem Renaissance paintings were, and we'll get there. So here's another couple of Ashcan School paintings, both of New York's Lower East Side. I really like this title. Here are some Dada-esque works by Man Ray, who would be a leading figure in the post-war New York art renaissance. Again, I just want you to show that these art movements also occurred in the United States. So Aaron Douglas was a Harlem Renaissance artist who illustrated a series of poems entitled God's Trombones by poet and composer James Weldon Johnson, who was also a major figure of the Harlem Renaissance and one of my favorite modern composers. You probably don't have time to play this in class, but his composition God's Trombones is illustrated with artwork on this video. You can check it out on Moodle. So this is probably the most famous work, or rather series of works, by a Harlem Renaissance artist, although it was actually produced during the early years of World War II. During and after World War I, millions of African Americans migrated north to find better jobs and to escape legally enforced segregation. I find Jacob Lawrence's images extraordinarily powerful. So here are two more panels from the series. The paintings in the series are very recognizable, and the College Board might well ask you to do that. What's not included here, though, are the very long caption titles that Lawrence gives these works. So number 49, our required work, is entitled, as you see, They Also Found Discrimination in the North, although it was much different from that which they had known in the South. Let's hear from our next presenter. So the majority of Southern blacks had migrated to the North with optimism, but many of them were disappointed to find that the North had its own brand of discrimination. The constant influx of black migrants into northern cities led to an unprecedented level of hostility on the part of northern whites. So restrictive housing, living and working policies abounded. This is a great example. The city of San Francisco actually sent experts to the Midwest to study techniques for keeping black migrants out. These migrants were often segregated into the most dilapidated sections of the city. They were forced to pay high prices for this inferior housing, and they faced widespread discrimination in the workplace. This led to race rioting in the summer of 1919. So this panel shows a public dining space. Blacks and whites are divided, as I'm sure you've talked about, by that yellow barrier that zigzags through the center of painting. Very strong use of line. It's further emphasized by those tilted tabletops and chairs situated against the backdrop of the restaurant floor. Note that the way he does the tables is reminiscent of Cezanne. And again, we're playing with perspective in space. So here's a formal analysis from the Phillips Gallery in Washington, D.C., which houses about half of the series. Others are at the Whitney. Stay tuned for that, those of you going to New York. So searing in their immediacy, the works show only essential imagery. I think it's a good point. Flattened, angular forms, strong diagonals, remember that shows action, and contrasts of light and shadow contribute to the dynamism of these images. Although Lawrence used a limited palette, not very many colors, he arranged the colors to form focal points to direct the viewer's attention. So how does he do that? Well, look at that red and green, the yellow and blue. As the narrative unfolds from image to image, the vantage point, the compositions, and the details change in a manner reminiscent of film, which was very important at the time. Some of the pictures are self-contained, others are expansive. In some panels, figures dominate, in others, the setting dominates. The people are not individualized. They represent collective characteristics, what in literature we call archetypes. It's actually a term taken from Jung, the psychologist. But Lawrence never loses sight of the human drama. So I was disappointed that Georgia O'Keeffe didn't make the cut. This painting reveals her fascination with New York City, where she'd arrived in 1918 from the metropolis of Canyon, Texas. But what she's really known for are her paintings of the Southwest, where she began to spend part of her year starting in 1929. And of course, she's almost also famous for her evocative close-ups of flowers. So, I'm going to shock people here again. There's a huge debate over whether Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings are thinly disguised renditions of female genitalia. Remember, this is the age of Freud. Everyone is obsessed with this. Remember how scary the women are in many of these male paintings we've seen. So in 1943, O'Keeffe finally responded to a suggestion that that's what she was painting, and this is what she said. I love it. Well, I made you take time to look at what I saw, and when you took time to really notice my flowers, you hung all your own associations with flowers on my flower, as if I think and see what you think and see, and I don't. A lot of people still aren't convinced. If you Google Georgia O'Keeffe, most of what you'll get is back and forth on whether her paintings are in fact erotic art. Feel free to check it out. Georgia O'Keeffe was discovered by and later married to the most prominent American photographer of the early 20th century, Alfred Stieglitz. This is probably his most famous photograph, and it's one of our required works. Next presenter, please. So here's what the Met website has to say about this work. The steerage began its life as a masterpiece, note, not as a photograph, but as an acknowledged masterpiece 4 years after it was created, when Stieglitz published it in a 1911 issue of Camera Work that was devoted exclusively to his photographs in the new style. And they were published together with Cubist drawing by Picasso. Now, Stieglitz loved to recount how the great painter had praised the collage-like dispersal of forms and the shifting depths of the steerage. The steerage is cubism. So it got canonized retroactively. And as a result, the photograph allowed Stieglitz to put his chosen medium on par with the experimental European painting and sculpture that he imported and exhibited in his gallery. In 1915, he lavishly reprinted the image in large-scale photogravure, basically a big picture photo, on both vellum, remember that's calfskin, and Japanese paper. Stieglitz rebelled against so-called art photography. He believed in straight, unmanipulated photographs that caught some important aspect of real life in the world around him. But he was a modernist, and one reason he and subsequent critics loved this photograph is how it captured a variety of geographic shapes. By the way, and you've probably heard this already, these migrants were being sent home to Europe. They didn't make the cut at Ellis Island. So here's another famous example of Stieglitz's work. I love the way the photo captures the dust thrown up by the wind and the horse's hooves. And here's one of the relatively few PG photos of his wife. Now, this work didn't make the cut either, but it's famous and beautiful. So, during the Depression, the government sponsored art as part of its relief programs. One of these artists was photographer Dorothea Lange, and her photographs of rural depression really transfixed Americans, and it helped create support for government relief programs. Here's another example of her work. This painting is actually post-Depression, but it still captures the bleak mood of an era racked first by economic and then by global catastrophe. Hopper's a very important American painter. So is this guy, and you've all seen this painting, right? Another major American artistic movement between the wars was called regionalism. It focused on rural life and returned to a more realistic style, sometimes large-scale murals. I cut that one out. I probably shouldn't have, because now I'm moving on to Mexican murals. The 1930s saw the rise of Mexican mural paintings. Note, by the way, that these are frescoes. And they had a strong political content, motivated by the Mexican Revolution that overthrew military rule early in the 20th century. And notice you'll see a strong influence of expressionism in this work. I think that military figure on the right could have come out of a Kirchner painting, also all those green faces. But here's our second to last required work, and she is not a Mexican muralist, although she was heavily influenced by them and married to the most important of them. So Frida Kahlo is often classed as a surrealist, but her work also includes political commentary and a great deal of personal autobiography. So here we see the artist torn between her two heritages, her Mexican mother and her German father. And let's move on to our first presenter, or excuse me, our second to last presenter. Okay, this is an old AP question about Frida Kahlo's work. Is she or isn't she a surrealist? I thought you might be interested in seeing her answer. If you had time, you can discuss this. Now, there is so much more I could and would like to say about Frida Kahlo, about her life history. I hope you've heard some of that from the presenter, and I would encourage you to hear more of it from Ms. Jacobs, who loves Frida Kahlo's work, as do I, and knows a great deal about her. By the way, I am leaving for Mexico in just a few hours, which is why I'm sounding so rushed and frantic. And one of the things I'm intending to do at my friend Ms. Jacobs' high recommendation is visit the Frida Kahlo Museum. I'll send blog postings from Mexico. So, as I mentioned, Frida Kahlo was married to Diego Rivera, who's the most famous of the Mexican mural painters. So here you see his depiction of the ancient Mexican Revolution. Rivera sparked a huge controversy when of ancient Mexico and the Mexican Revolution. Rivera sparked a huge controversy when the Rockefellers initially hired him to decorate the interior of their Art Deco building. When he included Lenin in his mural about progress, the Rockefellers fired him and his paintings were destroyed. Oops, these are out of order. Here's a painting of Frida and her famous husband, Diego Rivera, by Frida Kahlo. I think it's intriguing. He was a big guy. She was a small person. But notice how she's painted herself very small next to him and standing back. What do you think that might say about their relationship? Okay, last work. And let's hear from our last presenter. Now, terrible confession time. I have run out of time. These are incredibly complex paintings. And so I have was given freely, a set of PowerPoints from a fellow AP art history teacher, which gives a lot of information about just who is in these pictures and what's going on. I'm also going to kind of hand this one over to Ms. Jacobs, who has lived in Mexico, speaks Spanish, and knows a whole lot more about this than I do. But I'm going to try to run these slides for you, and you can go back and look at them in Moodle at your own convenience. Basically, what we're looking at is a Sunday afternoon where the citizens of the capital gather to sit, stroll, and chat. The first segment of the work begins with the conquest and the colonial period and moves on to the two 19th century wars of intervention, the Guerra de la Reforma, and the subsequent French and conservative attempt to impose the French Maximilian as emperor. Then the figures in the foreground come from the immediate past, and they seem to be dreaming, some with their eyes closed. They represent different social strata produced by the turn of the century Mexico of Rivera's childhood. They also show Spanish oppression and the power of church, as represented by Cortez with his bloody hands and the atrocities of the Inquisition. Rivera was not a big fan of the Catholic Church. Here we see Doña Carmen de Diaz advancing in silken feathers and pearls and lace, ready to buy Rivera's pictures on the day the revolution that was to drive her into exile broke out. Near her, in a yellow dress and gathered hair, is the insolent figure of La Revoltosa, the singer and prostitute Chuatlahu, I think I got that wrong, with her hands on her hips, staring down the policeman. And near her, on crutches, wearing a frock coat, is another real-life character from Diego's childhood, General Lobo Guerrero, a hero of the War of Intervention, who by then was known as General Medals. We see another policeman driving an Indian family out of the park. Above them, Zapata's horse rears over a barricade, bringing liberation, and the story ends with modern Mexico dominated by skyscrapers, a venal, sallow-faced priest in tinted spectacles, corrupt millionaires, and a corrupt president. When the picture was complete, a furious row broke out over one detail, a small historical text dating from the 19th century bearing the words, "God does not exist." The fresco was destined for the dining room of the new Hotel del Prado, but the Archbishop of Mexico refused to bless the building until the blasphemy was removed. So I'm just going to let these slides speak for themselves. And again, this will be up on Moodle. You see the different sections highlighted. Notice, by the way, the dark colors and tones used for the bad guys and how modern Mexicans, reforming Mexicans, the celebrating Mexicans are painted in much lighter tones. And now we have a few more images showing who's who. Remember Sor-Juana? We saw her in an earlier unit. There's the God does not exist, defending